Hello everyone! So I've got a video for you today looking into research paradigms. Let's get into it. So you might be asking, well, what is a research paradigm? Punch and Huancha would describe a paradigm as a set of assumptions about the world and assumptions about what constitutes the proper techniques and topics for inquiring into that world. Now, immediately we can see these are kind of quite broad themes that a paradigm will touch upon. Let's go a bit further. So what might these assumptions kind of be and be about? Well, a paradigm might make certain statements and certain assumptions about what the real world is, about the nature of reality and how it's composed. Similarly, about the nature of things within that reality. And thus how we should categorize things from other things, and also statements and assumptions about what being might mean, both being a thing and perhaps being human. Now, in technical terms, we might call these ontological assumptions. You don't need to remember the Greek for this, but ontology within philosophy is the study of reality and being. So paradigms will contain certain kind of beliefs and statements about what reality and being are and mean. But they go further. They also contain certain assumptions around how we can actually know about that reality, how we can learn and find the truth of reality. Now, you might also term these epistemological assumptions. Epistemology within philosophy is the study of knowledge. It's the study of how we can gain knowledge and how we can acquire truth, how we can verify what is true and false. All very good and all hopefully quite relevant to research. Paradigms go one further. They also perhaps implicitly tell us some things about what is right and wrong, morally and ethically. And on the basis of that, they tell us, about what the world should be like, what we should do as researchers and as people. You might think about these as axiological assumptions. So axiology is the realm of values and beliefs at a sort of assumed base level, without justification. Okay, so again, we can see that this is very broad, touching on some quite big questions. I want to take it back to the root, really, to try and make sense of this. So you've probably come across the word paradigm before, maybe even the phrase paradigm shift. Both of these really come from Thomas Kuhn, researcher. This book came out in 1962. And was quite groundbreaking in terms of how it used the ideas. So pre-Thomas Kuhn, there was this sort of assumption, sort of belief that science, as one method of inquiring into the world, just produced knowledge in a linear way, i.e. scientific discoveries just kind of sat on top of each other, accumulated, and we learnt more and more. Now, Kuhn basically blew that out of the water, and from his studies he found that actually it was a bit like a kind of balloon expanding, getting to a certain saturation point where it sort of couldn't hold any more within its current way of being, and then exploded, had a revolution. There was a paradigm shift and a new paradigm came on the scene that was more expansive in the way it viewed the world, and then discoveries kind of accumulated within that. So there was a shift from a kind of pre-scientific understanding of the world to Newtonian physics, for example, which then became the predominant paradigm within science, perhaps until Einstein then had his theory of general relativity, which proved Newtonian physics wrong in very certain contexts. So you can see how these kind of ways of thinking about the world will expand over time in a kind of non-linear fashion. You might argue there's been a similar paradigm shift within the 20th century, where we've exposed ourselves to some of the limits of human rationality. Previously in kind of Enlightenment scientific revolution terms. You might think about human beings as being rational, autonomous, and we've had some quite convincing scientific and philosophical discussions that are showing the limits of that understanding. So within a paradigm there are certain assumptions. Paradigms tend to come around at specific eras in time, and research within those times are sort of led, perhaps even constrained by the paradigms that are around, i.e. we do our research and we just kind of norm to the paradigms that we buy into, rather perhaps than challenging them. Here's another way of thinking about it. Paradigms sort of sit behind, below, and underpin the other work that we do as researchers. So methods are obviously very specific, isolated techniques at getting at the world, generating data, perhaps sampling methods. Methodology is the way of connecting those methods together with certain consistent ways of getting at particular research questions and topics. A paradigm sort of sits beneath and connects methodologies together, and certain methodologies will make sense within a certain paradigm's way of looking at the world, but maybe will not make sense within an alternate paradigm. One of the keys here that I think is really important is that we're often not really that aware of some of these things. So imagine this is a bit of an iceberg. I think for a lot of researchers, the method and the methodology are explicit, or at least part of the methodology is explicit in how we use it. And then there's a kind of area beneath the surface that's tacit, it's hidden, but is certainly, although a bit unconscious in how it's there, is active and is playing a part in defining our research. So there is a kind of contemporary divide that we're going to look at for the rest of the video. This is sometimes called the hermeneutic divide within philosophy. Basically, it's just looking at the difference between empiricism and interpretivism. Empiricism might also be called scientism or naturalism, is quite obviously dominant within the natural sciences. Interpretivist research, you can see from the word interpret, this is more dominant within the arts and the humanities. Now, I should say there are an awful lot more paradigms than these, but these are two that I think are kind of illustrative to compare so we can get our heads around the topic. Before we do, you might be saying, hold up, whoa, you've already told us that we don't need to be philosophers on this module. We don't need to use long words, even about methodology, necessarily. Why are we bothering with any of this? Well, I think looking at paradigms is useful for a few reasons. Firstly, I think we should look as responsible researchers to better account for our own assumptions, perhaps hidden assumptions about the world, knowledge and self, and how these impact on our research. Getting through our biases, not just of personal opinion, but the paradigms that we're embedded within. Whether we like it or not, these things will influence our research and our teaching as well. Also, I think fluency at speaking of paradigms and speaking at a kind of deeper philosophical level just is quite useful academically, both within your work but also in reading other people's work. Authors that you'll be reading as part of your course often advance their arguments, make critiques at different levels, whether at the level of method, whether that's suitable or not, or well orchestrated or not, methodology, but also challenges to the paradigm, in order to find things that are problematic or not helpful within the research. So if you can get fluency at speaking at those three levels and seeing their interconnection, then you'll be able to see and speak to a much finer level of nuance about research. And from a personal standpoint, I think that's not only enjoyable, that's also really helpful for conducting and challenging research out there in the world. So we're going to look at these two for the rest of the video, sort of look at each of them in turn. I'm going to give you some examples, both excerpts from articles and some quotes, and I'm going to invite you to pause the video at certain points, and when I do, just see if you can work out what you think about each of these two paradigms. Think for yourself, see if you can work out what are the kind of rules of each, how are they different, what are the different kind of aims, methods and assumptions within the field of research. So we're first going to look at empiricist research. On the left are some famous empiricist philosophers. On that top image you can see a very hard-working scientist. So even from the choice of images you might be able to infer something. Okay, here is an excerpt from an empirical, or rather an empiricist journal. Have a quick read, pause the video and see what you make of this. Okay, I'm assuming you've paused, you're ready. You might be asking, what was that? Yeah, it's sort of like another language, isn't it, if you're not trained with the natural sciences. Here's my stab at what the article is saying. Firstly, stellar evolutionary history can be inferred from electromagnetic stellar energy distribution. So these are their terms. Galactic dust absorbs and reflects some of that EM energy, and the article is calling this dust extinction. Physicists need to correct for dust extinction if they are to determine stellar histories. Babbage et al., the authors, compared the results of using two photometric codes with another method. They found a strong correlation between the results of the two photometric codes, and they also found quite a good correlation with the third method, when the poor accuracy of all three methods was taken into consideration. They concluded that the measurement of dust extinction was reliable but not accurate. Okay, again you might want to pause here, have a look at this argument as it's laid out. What are the assumptions, what are the beliefs, what is being valued here within research, and how are they conducting that research? Okay, let's take it one level more simple. Stephen Hawking, very clever chap, he might say that the universe is governed by rational laws that we can discover and understand. I think this is actually quite explicit about some of the main assumptions of an empiricist approach. I do love this quote. By the way, anyone who believes that the laws of physics are mere social conventions is invited to try transgressing those conventions from the windows of my apartment. I live on the 21st floor. Okay. So let's lay out some of this stuff so we can see it. Empiricist research assumes law-like explanations for the world. They assume that the world is governed by laws, and laws are stable, universal principles that apply across all cases, i.e. that we can find ways of seeing the world that are not contextually dependent. We can find consistent explanations that will build up everything. Second, empiricist research tends to examine effects of and relationships between measurable variables. You saw there before, we were using the senses, predominantly we were using sight through telescopes to measure differences between the history, which was a variable history of the stars with particular ways of viewing dust, all in order to kind of calculate very precisely and mathematically potentially cause and effect and the variance of that cause and effect. So this research is mostly, though not always, quantitative, based on producing statistical probability that we are correct or not. Okay? This is exemplified by the scientific method, as you've just seen, a piece of scientific research. One of the keys of the scientific method is what we would call falsification of a hypothesis. And this is the idea that you come up with something that you think might be the case. You then look for evidence not just of that hypothesis being correct, that's kind of affirmation, but you look for evidence that it's not true. And you also look for evidence of alternate hypotheses to see if they're true or not. And only once you've refuted all other possible explanations, then you have a defensible theory within an empiricist paradigm. Let's flip over to the other side then. I think this is almost a great band cover. This is a selection of kind of relatively famous interpretivist philosophers. Here is an interpretivist text. Again, pause here if you would like, have a read. Okay, and again, what? So within Chung's text, she was obviously using some quite precise technical language, even though it was perhaps more within our own disciplinary area. Firstly, she was saying that literary studies can be viewed not just as a kind of field, but as a sociological object. So as a thing that can be studied, and studied in terms of what composes it, how it's constituted, not just because kind of as a vague social thing. Sociological objects can be seen to be created and sustained, in part at least, by certain discourses. Now, discourse, it again is a technical, theoretical term, and discourse is focused on how knowledge is created and legitimised. Okay, so she's looking at the ways, the rules in which knowledge is created and legitimised within literary studies. She's making a statement that we can examine those rules, the process and configuration of practices within literary studies, and how they operate beyond ideas that are stated to create and legitimise knowledge. SAM, or social activity method, was used as a theoretical tool for doing that examination, and from using it is now supporting the claim between literary studies and what she's called the crisis discourse, which was obviously a thing, that's already been researched. It's the practices and rules of this dominant crisis discourse which themselves establish the identity of literary studies. Rather than the identity of literary studies defining the practices, it's actually how it's been affected by a certain discourse that is changing that field. Most importantly, I think this is where it's clearest at the end, they make the statement that while the findings of research do not directly generalise to other fields, the method of the research could be adapted for them. Again, you might want to quickly pause here and see what you think about the claims, the assumptions within this kind of research. Okay. This is Paul Standish now. In the social sciences, more than the physical sciences, results of tests rarely show conclusively what to do next and where. In light of this, interpretation comes to the fore. Interesting. So you might say and see then that interpretivism is not necessarily trying to disprove the sciences, but more think about where the physical sciences and empiricism is not effective, i.e. within arts and humanities. Or indeed the social sciences as well. So that's empiricist research. So interpretivist research assumes multiple and situationally appropriate interpretations and perspectives. There's not one consistent way of reading social interactions or human experience. This research examines the how and why of social events. That's basically what it's here to do, looking at the human world as constructed, as socially constructed by human beings. This research is mostly qualitative, again though not always. It's exploring specific cases, not universal principles, and the differences in experience, motivation, interpretation and meaning making between the humans that account for those cases, and looking at how all of this takes place within a wider socio-cultural context. Okay. Here's one way that you might think of positioning these two against each other again. This is some work that we did in class. So you could put kind of empiricism, interpretivism at two ends of a spectrum. Empiricism is very focused on the objective, it's focused on reliability, accuracy, forming really precise theoretical statements about empirical data. That's what it's all about. Trying to get things right through measurement. And there's a big focus on correcting previous research in light of new results. Correcting theory. People often accuse empiricism of what we might call positivism. Positivism is a bit of a dirty word in academia now, though there are still positivists about. Positivism basically says that not only does the universe run by kind of rational laws, but we humans can know about all of them, potentially, and if only we knew about all of the current and previous conditions, basically then we could predict the future if we could know everything, and they say that we can. Obviously not with current technological standards, but we could potentially. Interpretivism, this is subjective, and it's sort of trying to embrace the inherent subjectivity of being human. So they're looking to be peculiar and look at the peculiarity of specific settings, specific cases, and seeing how they're different. Interpretivist research tends to be open-ended, tends to gain multiple readings of reality. And they don't generalise research through scaling up to a wider population. Empiricism would look at a sample and then go, okay, this is statistically likely to be true for everyone else. Interpretivism would not make that statement. They would generalise through giving you a really deep, nuanced insight of a situation that might spark some creative thinking about your own situations. They wouldn't directly tell you these things are true or not true, more broadly. Interpretivism often gets accused of what we might term relativism. Relativism, again, is a very dirty word within academia because it sort of means that everything is relative. And if everything is relative, nothing has any meaning, and we can't build a stable theory or worldview off of that. There are basically no relativists, and there are very few positivists. So while those words get thrown around, they're generally used when rebutting someone else's argument. Okay, so I'm just going to compare some of the methods, the research methods, the really practical things that might fit under each paradigm. I'm going to tell you about the sampling procedures for each, their approaches to generalizability that we've touched on, and some common data generation methods that each might use. Empiricist research tends to be very focused on kind of clean, precise mathematical samples. So what you might call a representative sample, i.e. you have a wide population and you draw a sample that is as like the wider population as possible. And similarly, they will use kind of critical cases of people to illustrate that, and they'll use random allocation of people to those samples to try and get around the researcher's bias. All of this is done with an awful lot of statistics to show that you are doing these things appropriately. Interpretivist research, on the other hand, is not bothered by wider population because that's not the kind of claims they're making. They're looking at individual cases and examining the qualities of those most often. So they'll use things like theoretical and purposeful sampling, which is where the researcher knows what they want to look at, i.e. a particular phenomena, a particular group of people that have had a set of experiences. So the sample is then the people that have had those experiences. There's no need to include other people, from a wider pool. Similarly, the idea of opportunistic sampling, which is relevant to interpretivist research, is basically who you can reasonably get in that will be helpful for the project. I.e., if you're doing a piece of action research, you will need to be an opportunistic sampler in getting students that will sign up to your kind of research. In terms of generalisability, empiricist research, as I've said, looks from a sample to a wider population, and the claims they make are about doing that. They're also testing theories out here statistically, so there will be a certain hypothesis, they'll take some kind of theory from wider literature, and they will see if that's true for the wider population and more situations. Interpretivist research is actually really good at generating the theory that then gets used in the testing. Interpretivist research tends to get generalisability from an accumulation of cases, i.e. lots of individual case studies that sort of roughly sit on each other, and we get a greater sense about the kind of qualities of human experience. Or they directly generate a very robust theory from a small case, and then that theory you take it with other research to see if it's true later. Data generation. Empiricist research, being quite quantitative, would look at questionnaires, mostly numerical or scaled questionnaires, structured interviews, observations, tests and experiments, and content analysis. So content analysis is a way of quantifying a text. So for example, looking at textbooks, drawing a consistent grid across each page and counting the number of certain things. Interpretivist research might also conduct interviews, but they would generally be less structured. You're not necessarily trying to compare and get something stable between people, so you can find the qualities and the individual experience of the person in front of you. Why would you need a consistent question for that? They might use focus groups, less guided observation, photo elicitation, or again take a more qualitative approach to looking at documents and artefacts. Great, so hopefully that's really helpful in kind of getting through the heart of kind of how these two paradigms are different. And you might say that's a kind of really stable difference, that makes sense to you, in which case you're more than welcome to kind of stop the video now. If that distinction doesn't make sense to you, or you're interested in problematizing it, then let's go further. If so, I'll just invite you to consider how the difference between empiricism and interpretivism is like this bloke and his cutlery. Probably quite an unfair question, unless you know that bloke on the left is David Hume, and unless you're nerdy enough to know that there is something in philosophy called Hume's fork. Haha. Hume's fork says that you cannot get an ought from an is, i.e. that there are certain things, facts and values. The is the fact, the ought is the value. And these are separated, intrinsically different from one another, like the two ends of this fork. They do not touch. We cannot derive value from fact. I mean, that's sort of an interesting distinction, isn't it? Because that sort of then implies that empiricism, interpretivism are both kind of fine. They both deal with different domains in the world. Empiricism deals with factual knowledge of how the world is, and interpretivism thinks about values, potentially. Do we really think that that's true? Let's play with an example here. This is coming from Paul Standish. I'll link you to his paper at the end. It's a bit of an odd example. Torturing cats causes them unnecessary pain. Therefore, you shouldn't torture cats. Which of these is fact and which is value? Well, sort of the obvious thing to do is to say, okay, well, torturing cats causes them unnecessary pain. That's a kind of is statement. That's saying something factual about the world. Therefore, you shouldn't torture cats. Well, therefore, that's a kind of ought statement. We ought not to torture cats. Great. Simple. Is it? No, I think we need something additional here. There's probably another statement that we need to make. Torturing cats causes them unnecessary pain. Yes, that's our is statement. But we need to say that you ought not to cause unnecessary pain. We haven't defined that that's a bad thing. This is a kind of general moral value that we implicitly buy into. Therefore, on the basis of that, you should not torture cats. This is our specific and applied ought statement. Again, okay, great, this looks fine on the face of it. But I think something else is problematic here. Are there any of these words that we think isn't just in the realm of facts but contains value? I think there are. All the words that are highlighted, I think, do sort of connote some very specific values. The word unnecessary, how can you derive what is necessary and unnecessary purely from the factual world? For something to be necessary, it's necessary for a certain end, and ends are derived from values, the things that we believe should be in the world. These are our aims. Similarly, the word pain. How can we understand the concept of pain if not from a relative position, being a human subject, having experienced pain, knowing it and experiencing that in our bodies as something that's unpleasant? Again, the word torturing. What is to torture other than to cause unnecessary pain or to cause pain to a particular animal? This statement's almost a tautology. It's almost saying exactly the same thing. But I think we can go one further, because you might say, okay, well, this contains some values, but, cat, even the word, at least the word cat, come on, that is a factual statement. There's no value in the word cat. Or is there? Well, think about how you understand the word cat. Probably as a pet, probably as something that's very nice to kind of, to pet, to give food to. But that's not the only way that people would understand what a cat is. There are different cultural conceptions. We might view them as pets, others might view them as pests. Other cultures might look at them as a food source and have a very different way of understanding what the cat is in relation to other concepts on the back of that. Similarly, we might think of the contextual meaning of cat as being not rat, or not dog, or chaser of rat. Or we might define cat in a very specific kind of way because of it being what we might think of as a sentient life form compared to, say, a rock or a tree. Our way of defining it is absolutely embedded in what it means to be a human being with all manner of experiences and positions and beliefs that have been derived from being a human being, and we use that to understand even a factual statement like cat. You could think about it being true for a tree as well. How would we understand a tree without a certain relationship of size to the tree? We would probably understand a tree without its roots initially, simply because we can't see them. So you see here that although things appear factual, even our human way of looking at facts is in part subjective. So my point with this little ramble is to just kind of observe that our conception of things, even innocuous little things that look purely factual and empirical, all require some level of comparison with other concepts which stems from a human subjective position of the reviewer, i.e. us. There's quite a famous phrase from Ludwig Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations, and he says that even if a lion could speak, we would not understand him. I.e., even if a lion had the powers of human language and was talking to us in our language, we wouldn't get what the lion was meaning or talking about, because their way of understanding reality, from being a four-legged creature driven by very different biological and psychological impulses, there would be no conversation that we could have between the two of us because our worlds are so different. For this, and being quite explicit, this is a bit of an interpretivist position here. Values go all the way down. There is nothing that does not contain value, at least in the way as human beings that we get to and understand the world. So what does this imply for research? Well, it might imply an interpretivist position. that since values go all the way down, there will naturally be values embedded within the sciences, perhaps values that an empiricist researcher might not see through their claims for objectivity. It might imply a whole host of other things. You might not even believe or buy into this particular statement or buy into part of it. But hopefully this has given you at least some fuel for challenging the very neat distinction between those two paradigms that we've looked at. Maybe there's greater overlap than we're really giving credit for. So here's some potential reading. That's certainly enough of me droning on for the video. Any of the core texts about research will give you an awful lot to discuss in terms of different paradigms. If you're interested in considering this last issue of kind of value and bias, particularly when looking at data, here are two fantastic articles for you to look at. And finally, if you want to go read Thomas Kuhn's original text, it's absolutely fantastic. Probably wait till after your course. It's quite meaty, but certainly very enjoyable. That's it. Take care, guys. See ya.